So this is my second Titanic video that I'm making, and this Titanic video is probably going to be about 5 minutes long, hopefully no longer than that. But this video is basically going to be my recommendations on basic Titanic books that I think every person should read, and or basic ocean liner books that everyone should read. Now, obviously, I picked out some books that I think that people should read, that I have read all of these various books over time. I think one of them I'm still trying to finish. Not sure which one it is. Oh, it's the one that with the picture of the Mauritania on it that I have to finish. I've read basically 5 or 6 chapters of it, and it's a very good book. But one of the books that's not here, that my friend actually has at his house and hasn't given to me yet, is A Night to Remember. And anybody who is a Titanic buff or into Titanic history or wants to have a basic understanding of Titanic from the point of view of survivors, I would recommend people read A Night to Remember. Now, the key thing that you have to remember about A Night to Remember is the book was written in 1955. So that's almost 65 years ago. So you have to take what you read in A Night to Remember with a grain of salt, because new information has been discovered, and I'll discuss that later in the other books that you see in front of you. So I recommend when you read A Night to Remember to take it with a grain of salt. But even before you read A Night to Remember, I recommend, if your reading level is not that high up, to read basic children's Titanic books to get you started. They have a lot of colorful pictures. They have basic Titanic facts as far as the ship dimensions and the size of Titanic and the amount of lifeboats and so forth. So if your reading level is not up to par, I would recommend reading children's books first before reading A Night to Remember or any more advanced Titanic books. And if you can't read A Night to Remember and your reading level is not that good, you can go on YouTube, and there are actually, I think, 5 or 6 videos on YouTube where a British narrator, I believe, actually reads the entire book out for you. So if you can't read A Night to Remember, or you are just tired of reading it, you can go on YouTube and you can listen to it. Now I'll get into the books that are in front of me right now. The first book I'm going to pick up, and this is probably one of my favorite books that I've read, is It's Transatlantic. And this book is basically a book about transatlantic shipping lines that existed from 1840 up until 1913. So it covers the period from 1840 up to 1913. And it basically gives you a basic foundation of the creation of these transatlantic steamship lines, the trouble that they had. One of my friends who read this book compared it to cars, the way in which, the development of cars got started with Henry Ford and so forth. So this is a very good book. There is a lot of information in this book. It's probably like 300 pages long. I've learned a great deal about how difficult it was prior to the Grand Transatlantic Ocean Liners for steerage passengers. I've learned about the social and political implications of creating a steamship line, the difficulty of maintaining reliable service, mail contracts, and so forth. So I really recommend reading this book by Stephen Fox. Very good book, very well written. We get to the other book here. This one is about the Lusitania by Diana Preston. This is a very, very detail-oriented good book. If you are into the history of the Lusitania and her sinking, I recommend you reading this book. This is a very wonderfully written, detail-oriented book. I like the way it's written, easy to understand. Pretty basic reading level. I think any 10th grader or 11th grader in high school in America, or if you're in the UK, any person in their senior year in the UK could read this book. It gives you a basic understanding of Lusitania from her birth until her death. So I really, really recommend reading this book. She did a very wonderful job on this book, and I really liked it a lot. So before I get to the Titanic books that are non-controversial, I'm going to recommend people read this book, The Last Log of the Titanic. It is a very controversial book. It presents a lot of alternative theories and facts. But I think David Brown did a really good job at the writing. There is some valuable information in here, despite all the controversy, that I think would be wonderful for Titanic buffs and historians to read. Now, keep in mind that this book is very controversial and presents some very controversial opinions, such as the fact that J. Bruce Ismay, which we have absolutely no evidence of, forced Captain Smith to sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia. So that's one of the controversies in this book. But there are some things in this book that I really like. For example, if you can see in the video, you can see that he pretty much gets the Titanic watch schedule for the officers pretty accurate here. I mean, for example, if you look at where it says Chief Officer Henry Wilde, he gets his 2 a.m. senior watch shift correct. He gets William McMaster Murdoch's shifts correct. He gets Charles Officer Herbert Lightollers shifts correct. He gets Herbert Pittman's. So he gets a lot of things correct. And another thing that I like about this book, aside from the controversies of the book, is if you look in the back of the, and this is just some of my highlightings here, if you look in the back of the glossary here, it gives you some very important nautical terms. And if you're going to read Titanic books, I think it's important for you to have an understanding of what these nautical terms mean. For example, I'll give you an easy one. It says port. The left side of the ship when facing forward, or pertaining to the left side of the ship when facing forward. Quartermaster. It defines what RMS is. So there are some valuable information in this book, and I recommend people reading it because you can't just say that you've read every single Titanic book and that you're an expert. Now, keep in mind, this book is very controversial and presents a lot of alternative facts. I pretty much enjoyed the book. It got me thinking about a lot of things. It makes me question a lot of things. Even some of the basic things that we know about Titanic, it makes me question. So I recommend reading this book. Now we're going to get to the very Harvard University type books that I really recommend people read. This book, SS Titanic, a Centennial Reprisal, is written by at least 10 different authors and Titanic historians. This book here, I'm still trying to process this book in my mind, but this book is extremely helpful in terms of understanding Titanic from different perspectives, from different historians. And not only is this book helpful in that regard, because you've got 10 different people writing this book, it's also very technical. Extremely technical, very detail-oriented, and each chapter is a different chapter. And each chapter is written by a different set of authors. So, for example, if we go to, where are we? Chapter 8, for example. This chapter is written by George Behe, for example, and Kathy Akins Jordan, for example. And it talks about too few lifeboats, too many hindrances, sorry. So it talks about the lifeboat situation. And I think this chapter discusses whether or not having more lifeboats would help or would not have helped. So I recommend people reading this book. But keep in mind that this book is very technical. I think it's a very difficult book to read and understand. I certainly had a tough time understanding some of it because it's just so much new information in this book that I'm still trying to process. And this book was written in 2011. So this book was written 7 years ago. And the other one that everybody raves about, the last but not least, is On a Sea of Glass, The Life and Loss of the Titanic. Now, I gave this book an 85, and some of the people who wrote this book were a little bit disappointed about it. I have never given a Titanic book anything over a 90. Any book that I have ever read has never gotten 100% from me. And the reason why I don't give 100% to books is because even though this book is very well written, it was researched, they did their homework, it has a flavor of A Night to Remember to it. So if you like A Night to Remember, you're going to like this book because it has a similar flavor to it and a similar format. It is a very long book. It has so much new details and information in it. I am still trying to process the stuff in this book. As a matter of fact, I think I have to go back and read one chapter. Again, I'm not sure if I even finished this book. It's just so much information in it. But I would save this book for last. I would not read this book until you have read other Titanic books. Because once you get a basic understanding of Titanic history, for example, when Titanic sailed, what port she sailed from, the time that she struck the iceberg, and so forth, then you'll be able to appreciate this book better, and you'll be able to have a really good understanding of what the authors are trying to convey in this book. And not only that, but these authors have recently wrote, and I haven't even bothered to read it yet because I'm so backed up with other Titanic books and ocean liner books, is they wrote a 175-page mini book about the clocks and the time on Titanic, and they investigated that and took apart all of the conventional information that we know about time, and it's a very wonderful article. I summarized through some of it. Pretty similar format to the book that I'm looking at and explaining to you right now. Lots of colorful pictures in this book. There are some things in this book that I disagree with. There are some things in this book that I still question. But I think anybody who is a Titanic enthusiast or a buff, or anybody that's into Titanic history, you're really going to enjoy this book. Now, I would say, because the chapters are very long, depending upon your reading speed, it took me about almost a month to read this book because I took my time with it. I basically read a chapter a day, or a half a chapter a day in this case, because basically the chapters are basically 2 chapters in 1 chapter. So much new information in this book. For example, I'll give you an example of the new information in this book. If I can find a picture in here, in this book. I don't know if I can find it. But there is a picture of the Titanic sailing from Southampton, and they point out that the chief officer of Titanic, Henry T. Wilde, is seen at the bow. So that itty-bitty little person is actually the chief officer. I hope I got that right from my memory. So that's something that was new. I also discovered that Titanic did not exactly sail at 12 o'clock noon on the dot. It was more between 12 o'clock and 12:15. And I also discovered by reading this book, which I never even knew this, and I should be ashamed of myself because I've read so many Titanic books in my life. Most of them from the 90s because I'm 32 years old now. So I'm getting up there in age. But actually, one of the boat trains that left Southampton was late and didn't get into Southampton water until 11:45 almost. So it was cutting it really, really close, and I didn't know that. Also, if you look at the picture in the front page, you can see that it's not exactly going down by the head, as is portrayed in the movies and as has been portrayed in many, many books. It's actually having a list to port, for example. And I think they explained that in the book. So that is just basically my reviews of Titanic book. One more thing before I go. I really think you should read this book. This is another one that's really, really old. It's by John Maxtone Graham. His son is I think his son is a producer or a writer for The Simpsons. Ian Maxtone Graham. So if you look up Ian Maxtone Graham, you can see the resemblance between the two. It looks exactly like his father. It's really weird. He recently died I said this year, sorry. He recently died a couple of years ago, and it was really sad. I always loved listening to him because he had like a very mid-Atlantic British accent. He sounded so British and so upper crust, so to speak. But this book explains, again, it's very similar to Transatlantic book, but this book explains transatlantic history from the Mauritania up into the Queen Elizabeth. And it explains the golden age of transatlantic travel. It explains the Roaring Twenties. It explains the war. It explains the downfall of transatlantic ocean liners after the 1950s with the invert of airplanes, which I'm really upset about. I don't know why everybody wants to fly across the Atlantic to England when they can be in a nice private cabin for 3.5 days. But that's neither here nor there. So I recommend people reading this book. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's 16. I spent 16 minutes talking about it. I said 5 minutes, but you know when you're talking about Titanic history and ocean liner history, it's longer than that. So that's it. Hopefully I'll make a third Titanic ocean liner video in the future.